Hey, Mike here, ZERMELOmusic.com, and in this video, I want to walk you through the groove of a recent track of mine, Digging in the Crates, which is being released today, May 15th, on Vanilla Ace's label, Wildcard. It sounds like this. Now, fun backstory on the track, Graham from Data Transmission made a video with Sam, Vanilla Ace, on how to find samples. And I left a stupid little comment on that video saying, hey, why don't I sample this video? But they thought it was a good idea, so I whipped up a track. And wouldn't you know, Vanilla Ace liked it for his label, so we are releasing it on Wildcard. All right, so let's dive in and check out the groove. All right, we'll go over the basic beat first. That's going to be the kick, clap, and the open hat. Now, the basic beat is really the backbone of the track, so that's really something I want to get right. And so this is the kick. We'll start with the kick. It has 3 layers. The first layer is just a really clean kick sample. Just really clicky on the front, got a nice sub in the low end. And then we have this room sound here. And if we just look at the processing on the room sound here, I'm using this compressor to isolate the transient. You can see I have a pretty slow attack here and just 120 milliseconds. So I'm going to turn all this off here, and you'll hear that it's just really clamping down on it. If I turn it off, get more of that punch. You could also use a gate. You could use a transient designer. I'm just happen to use a compressor in this case. Then we're running it through some saturation just to give it some level, beef it up a little bit. A little bit of grit, throw that into a reverb here. Pretty short room reverb, almost 500 milliseconds. And then an EQ just to remove any more of the low end and keep that mid-range. Finally, we have this kick punch layer, just a kick with a little bit more mid-range. Okay, and then an EQ to cut out the low end. Saturation to beef it up a little bit. And then here I'm using the micro shift from Sound Toys just to widen it a little bit. Just to get it around the click or the transient of the original kick sample. And so let me play the main kick by itself and then we'll add in both of the layers. So here we go. And then all 3 of these kicks are going to be running into these 2 plugins. We have a FabFilter EQ, doing a little boost in the low end, give it a little bit more oomph. Here we're giving it a little bit more articulation, boosting it in the top, and we're gutting the mid-range just a little bit to make more room for the other sounds in the mix. And then here with the Kazrog K-Clip, that is a clipping plugin, kind of like a limiter, except it clips the peaks. It handles them in a more aggressive way, introducing a little bit more grit. And you can see we're only driving this about a half a dB, so it's not doing much, but together we just get a little bit extra edge out of the kick. So here's before, after. So that was the kick. Let's move on to the clap. Here we go. You can hear there's some reverb on there, so I'm going to turn that off for now. So clap verb, there we go. And with the snare, let's start there. Here we go. So just a sample. And then here we have an EQ8, just high passing into some saturation. You're going to see this on almost every track, just EQ into saturation. That's pretty much how I'll process every sound. Okay, so very simple there. Then we have another clap layer. So that's obviously more in the mid-range. So here the snare is as a brightness. It has kind of a low mid quality to it. And then this clap's going to fill out that mids. Okay, so this clap, again, just EQ into saturation. Here we're just high passing saturation. We're also introducing a little bit of width, so it kind of wraps around that snare a little bit. And then just a little bit of limiting, just controlling the peak just a little bit. And then we have a clap pre. So this is just something, if I zoom in here, you'll see it happens just before the beats. So we have this guy right here, and that's just a loop. And basically what I did is just isolated that little pre-clap, made room for the other claps here using the clip gain, and then just left some of that tail because I liked the texture that was on the clap in this loop. But that sounds like this. Okay, it sounds kind of like a rim with a little bit of ambience on it, but I like that. And so there's no processing on that. So all together again. And if we remember, we're sending that to a clap reverb. So let's check that out real quick. Here's with the reverb. Without. Okay, and so this is very easy. I'm pretty sure this is just Ableton's default setting with the reverb. Maybe I adjusted the decay time. It doesn't look like it. But other than that, we just have this pre-reverb EQ, taking out a lot of the lows, taking out some of the highs, just really focusing on that mid-range. And so if we play the kick and the clap together, let's check that out. Cool. And adding in the open hats, let's check this out. Sweet. So starting with the main hat, let's see what we got. So you can hear this is already a layered sound. It's got a nice, bright, scratchy top to it. It's got a strong kind of upper mids. And here I'm just kind of gutting the low end. We don't really need it. I'm taking away a little bit of the harshness again, but EQ into saturation. And then we have this bright sample. I felt that sample could benefit from a little bit extra brightness. So you can hear this is just a really bright, short, snappy sound, a little bit of a transient. And again, just high pass into some saturation. And then in this case, I'm also adding a transient designer. This is from Native Instruments, the Transient Master. But you can see I'm just cranking the attack and bringing the sustain all the way down and making the gain up, because when you crank the attack, it's going to boost the gain. So I'm turning down the output just a little bit there. But without the transient designer, let's see what it sounds like. With... So super short and tight, just giving a little bit of extra smack on a little bit of extra transient on that hat. And then we have this accent hat that doesn't play all the time, just kind of plays at the end of every 2 bars. And that sounds like this. So super strong in the mid-range there. We have an auto pan on this just to get this hat to move around. It's more of a flavor, as you can see, not playing every single time. And then I have this overdrive driving 2K. That's going to sit under the other 2 hats and really bring out, again, that mid-range in this hat. And then finally just an EQ to shape it just a little bit, remove any of the frequencies that we don't need. And so if I take this off, for example, let's listen to what it sounds like. Okay, with it on. So super strong again in the mid-range. So all together, hear that? Just sits right underneath those other 2 hats. And so all together again, the kick, the clap, and the open hat. So that was the kick, clap, and the open hat. Now we'll move on to bass. So this is the bass patch. I used Massive. I kind of wish I used Operator, because people tend to be more comfortable with the Ableton only rather than third party. But a synth is a synth, right? You have oscillators that go into a filter. And in this case, we have a saw wave, very typical, right, in tech house music to use a saw wave. Of course, you could use a square, sine, triangle, stuff like that, but saw wave is probably the most popular. So we have a saw wave, and then we have another oscillator here, an octave up. This is a little bit unusual for me, but what I was doing is just trying to find another sound that added some interesting harmonics, some unique character to the bass. So I was just kind of going through the different waveforms here, literally just one at a time, hitting this next thing, waiting till something kind of stood out. And I landed on this wavetable here and zeroed in on this wavetable position or waveform. And if you think about it, all these just differ in their harmonic distribution. And so you just have to find something that just stands out to you that's a little bit unique. And so let me play without this really quick. So just the first oscillator, the saw wave. And then the second oscillator here. So just add some interesting harmonics on top, right? And then together they just make something really fat. All right, and then both of these oscillators are running into filter 1, low pass 4. Sometimes I'll use the daft. I'll just try whichever one sounds better. And this is being controlled. The cutoff here is being controlled by envelope 3, just a pluck style. We have 0 sustain and just a little bit of decay. And then from the filter, we're going into the effects section. I always like to try one of these tube distortions here in Massive, and it looks like the classic tube 1, just a little bit of drive and mix that in pretty heavily. And finally with the EQ, we have a bit of a low boost here, and I brought the high shelf all the way down. Now that's the bulk of the sound. There's a couple details here. First, I'm using the second envelope here to modulate the pitch. You can see a quick decay down from 5 octaves up, and that's just going to add a little bit of knock onto the oscillators. So let me turn this off. Turn it on. Lastly, we have this LFO here, and I'm kind of reluctant to talk about it because it seems like a bigger deal than it is. Here we have some random waveforms. I also have Massive's randomization macro controlling the crossfade and the amplitude of the LFO. And then the LFO is being assigned to the oscillators here, the pitch, also the amp of oscillator 2, the cutoff of the filter, and the drive of the tube distortion. But the thing is, I'm going to bounce the bass down to the smallest loop that I can in the mix anyway, just so I get this perfectly consistent bass. So this LFO is not really doing anything. It was just me kind of having fun in the production stages. But that is the patch. And now let's check out the processing. After. So the first plugin here is my attempt at recreating the Voice of God hardware. The Voice of God hardware is just a high-pass filter, basically with a sharp resonant spike, and you can control the intensity of that spike. So that's what I have going on here. And you could do this in Ableton's EQ as well. The only difference is here in Pro Q, you can see I have a 48 dB per octave slope here on the high pass, but you could do that in Ableton's here if we just get the sharp kind of filter, and then if we get another one, okay, and then that way we can control both of them. So with both of these, that basically creates a 48 dB slope, and then you can just kind of adjust the resonance by changing the Q value on both of those filters. But that's all that's really going on in here. You can see I also have a low pass filter with a little bit of resonant bump, but this Voice of God plugin here is doing quite a bit in giving the bass its tone and character. So here's before and after. Next, we have Pro Q here, just doing a little bit of shaping, a little bit of lows bump, and then taking out around 180, it looks like. Here we have Ozone's Exciter, just giving a little bit of edge above 156 hertz. This is going to be so subtle that it's probably not even worth playing, but here's before. Very hard to hear, but I just, at the time, I guess I thought it was giving it a little bit of edge. Next, we have Ozone's Imager, and this is just widening the frequencies above 156 hertz. And this is giving a lot of the bass its character as well, just giving it that stereo dimension. So now the thing about widening is that it can kind of do some weird things to the dynamics of the sound, just make it kind of move around a little bit too much. So I'm adding this compressor, this I call it a sausage compressor, and basically you could do this with Ableton's compressor too, just 5 millisecond attack, 5 millisecond release, very small ratio, but really bringing the threshold down. And I bring the threshold down so that it's constantly giving me about 3 decibels of gain reduction. And so any kind of minor changes in the dynamics that come out of the imager, for example, they're going to be controlled by the R compressor here, and it's just going to kind of lock it into place. Because the sound, the bass doesn't need to have a pluck, it doesn't need to really punch that much, and needs to just have this nice tight sustain in the mix. And so that's what this is helping me achieve, is really just leveling out the level of the bass. Finally, we have Redux here with a bit reduction at 10. So it starts up here, we brought it down to 10. This just gives a little bit of air and weirdness on the top of the bass. So before, after, and then everything else just high pass, low pass for automation throughout the mix. And then, like I said, I like to bounce that bass down to audio and then just loop over a very small section of the bass sound. So that way I'm getting a perfectly consistent bass sound across the entire track. And this is the bass line. you could see it's in F minor here. We have F, and then we have the minor third, technically A flat, but written G sharp here. And then I added this little note here just to give a little bit more of a dramatic leap up to the minor third here. And originally I wrote the bass line just as a little one bar loop like this, but then I doubled it, took that first note and jumped it up a semitone, giving a little bit of a Phrygian vibe here, F to F sharp. And then at the end, you can see I took the last note and just dropped it down 2 semitones just to add a little bit of variation and a little bit of a turnaround back to the first note here. So. Finally, with the bass, we have this bass layer that's just adding a little bit of harmonics to the bass. And that's kind of automated throughout the track, just bringing it in and taking it away at different times in the track. But this is very simple. It's just a sample. And we're removing the low end here. And let's see what that's. So that's the original sound. It's just wide. I liked the width of it, giving a little bit of extra character to the wide bass sound. And then just an EQ to remove the low end and just a dip a little bit more, apparently, with Pro Q. But if we add that on top, let's check out the bass without it. With it. And as we get further on, so that's just there to kind of add some extra interesting harmonics and to increase the kind of intensity of the bass over time. All right, so that was the basic beat and the bass, and now let's move on and check out the percussion. So back to this view, but just for a second, I just want to talk about the 2 different approaches to percussion. On the one hand, you have the minimal style, and then the other hand, you have the kind of denser, more busy style. Okay, and with the minimal style, I think of Pazza. Clooney sometimes has some minimal percussion, Fisher too, where you're just picking a couple sounds and you're strategically placing them. And then on the busier side, I think of Tool Room, for example, really has nice dense productions. And then Rene Amesz, for example, Max Chapman also. It's not like just stockpiling percussion, but it's just busier. There's just more going on there. And each style has their own challenge. With the minimal side, you have to try to get the most out of everything, but on the busy side, you have to make sure you're not creating a chaotic mess. And so with this track, I have to try to not create a chaotic mess. So how do you do that? One of the things you could do is try to create a motif. And a motif is a way that you can layer all the percussion so that almost creates like a little drum melody, a kind of like a catchy little rhythm that just repeats over the track. And that's something that the listener can really latch onto and pay attention to. It's easy to understand. It's kind of like a little hook. And again, it repeats over time. And so it helps with the repetitive nature of the track, but you don't want it to get too overly repetitive. So there's a little bit of a balance. And so you have to introduce a little bit of variation. So I'm going to show you what I did, number 1, to kind of create the motif and then add some variation so it doesn't get too repetitive. We'll go through each sound and then we'll finish the percussion section off here by looking at some of the filler sounds like shakers and rides. All right, so let's dive in and check out the motif. So here's all the little motif sounds played with the basic beat. So that's pretty much it. And so basically what's going on, let's just walk through it. We'll have a rim shot here, and we have an open, like a breath that kind of takes us into this clap right here. So check this out. So rim, then we have a breath that takes us into the clap. So boot-dippa, da-boot-dappa. Okay, and then we have that little ride that carries us over, and then we're gonna have. Then we have the response to the rim right here. So this is the original rim, and there's not one on the back end. But we do have one right here. And then we have a tom here that brings us into the clap. So here we have a breath that brings us into the clap. Here we have a tom that brings us into the clap. So here's the breath. Here's the tom. And then here we have an open hat at the end of the 2 bars that just kind of closes it out. So here's the whole thing again. All right, and that just repeats. And that basically repeats throughout the entire track. But of course, what we said is we need to introduce some variation. And so here at the end, we have a fill. Check it out. Okay, and that's pretty much it. And then that whole thing repeats basically, and then we have a slightly different, what's it called, fill at the end over here. So here's one fill, here's another fill. We also have a kick cut right here just to make it a little bit more dramatic at the end of the 8-bar section. So that's basically the motif. Let's look at the individual sounds, starting with the first sound, which is the rim shot, which is right here. So this is the rim. Let's check it out. Just a 909 rim. This is just the 909 core kit from Ableton, and we just have a little bit of EQ. And the next sound was the vocal little breath, and that's taken actually from Graham in the video. And so let's listen to this. That's it, just the breath. That's it. And then we have the ride. So this little ride accent layer. So you can see there's a bunch of sounds that just kind of add up to this little motif thing. That's it, just a ride. And if we look, it's just going to be what we looked at before, which is EQ into saturation, basically. Here I'm using overdrive to really bring out the, just to really bring it over the other drum sounds. So 8K, so bringing it over the open hats, really, and just over all the drums. And so really accenting those bright frequencies so it stands out in the mix. And then EQ, just cutting everything away that I don't need. And what is this fab filter doing? Taking away a little bit of harshness, it looks like, into saturation. And this is a limiter. Okay, barely doing anything, but that is just about it. And so that is the ride. And here we have the tom. The tom also brings us into the clap right here. But if you remember, in between these two, we had the rim. So you can see here's the rim right there playing the two notes instead of the one note. And so this tom, what is the tom doing? This is just an 808 tom doing absolutely nothing. Just, oh, there's no processing on it. Just a straight up tom. That's it. And then finally we had that open hat that we already looked at. And that's in the open hat group here, right here, right at the end. And finally, the thing that we have in the motif is kind of a variation in the motif. I would call this whole part the motif, and then what we do is just kind of break it up, though, with these fills. Okay, there's one, and then just a little switch up over here. And on the fill, it looks like just an EQ doing very little, just taking a little bit out around 600, and then a gate just to make this a little bit tighter. And so those were all the sounds in the percussion motif. And remember, the percussion motif, especially when you have a busy percussion arrangement, it's a great way to present all the percussion sounds so that you get this kind of catchy drum melody, like we were saying. It's something that the listener can latch on to, and it's easier to just understand from a listener's perspective. Plus, the motif really contributes to the kind of hypnotic vibe of a tech house groove. And so now what we'll do, though, is look at the rest of the percussion sounds, the kind of filler sounds, like rides and stuff, and they just fill out the frequency spectrum, fill out the groove, just contribute to a much fuller arrangement sound. And the ride here is the first one that we're going to look at. So super dirty, you can hear that that's part of a loop there. And again, it's just me using an EQ, though, to remove what I don't need from that loop, just to kind of keep the ride. And then again, into some saturation, which we saw a million times. And then the other cool thing about this is the auto pan, because now I'm going to introduce some kind of stereo movement in the top end with this ride. So in the groove, the ride sounds like this. Next, we have a closed hat. This is just a 909 sample from Ableton's chord kit, a little bit of EQ, and just a sidechain from the hat. So that way, when the open hat plays, we're going to duck down the closed hat. Just a 16th note pattern that is playing here. So it sounds like this. Cool. And then in the groove, we'll add it in here. Then here we have this tops loop. Let's see what this is doing. Okay, not very much. It's kind of like an accent hat that we had in the open hat group, like this guy, but for whatever reason, it just ended up in the tops loop group. Okay, and here we just have an EQ taking it out. I just liked the bright hat, apparently. And then with the shakers, we have 2 shakers, one panned far right, the other one all the way left. You can see it's just pretty much EQ, and then for this one, just EQ into a little bit of saturation. Just again, removing everything that we don't need, and they sound like this. And in the context of the groove, so one thing to kind of point out, though, is the ride is kind of moving around in between the shakers. The shakers are hard panned, but the ride here is not fully spread, as you can see that. The amount is only 62. So the ride's kind of moving in between the shakers. Let me play those two together. So hopefully you could hear that. The shakers are very wide on the left and the right, and the ride's just kind of moving in between them. And that's kind of giving a nice little stereo balance to the top end, making sure that we have that width, but then also have some interesting movement in between. And then finally, we have these 2 percussion sounds. We have this snare. Then here we have another snare. You see most of these is just pretty much EQ. And so with the basic beat, they sound like this. See, this guy is just going boom, da ba da ba da boom, da ba da ba da boom, da ba da ba da, and so it just kind of fills it out that way. And this other one's kind of playing this kind of counter motif to the bass and to the motif that we had. And that's pretty much it. So in the context of the whole production, let's listen to it. So I hope you felt that when I took them away the second time around, you just felt like you were missing something. And that's kind of all they're doing. They're just, again, filling out the groove, filling out the frequency spectrum, and contributing in that way. So that's it. That is the groove. I hope you enjoyed the walkthrough. I hope you learned a thing or two. If you have any questions, leave them down below in the comment section. All right, so thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Peace. Vanilla Ace.